Dr. Shirley Better, in the ninth chapter of her primer on strategies for social change, embraces the idea or the concept of community organization as an important force, an important strategy, group strategy for dynamic social change. Initially, her model entitled The Unsuspecting Fly makes us aware of the contradictions of social inequality that exist within human society today. It is these inequalities, then, that make us aware of the need for change and inspire such things as social movements. Dr. Better writes in her primer, a group strategy historically is successful in confronting the power elite, and this group strategy is community organization. Persons are encouraged to first examine their immediate surroundings for signs of cultural insensitivity and, of course, inequality, and then look to the wider community. They are to engage jobs, schools, religious organizations, all in a sense either as tools for social change or as things that are in need of reform. Each of these arenas, she writes, poses unique opportunities at both individual and group levels for change. So, what she's doing here is she's challenging us to not only recognize inequality in our social settings, but then to take advantage of the group structures, of the community organizations that already exist to be able to exact change or to develop our own unique strategies on a community wide level to be able to inspire change. So, some of the study questions that she asks or challenges her readers with in this ninth chapter include what suggestions you may have for modifying the home to reflect more multiculturalism, listing out suggestions for creating positive atmospheres with regard to your environments, your work environment, signs of racism in the workplace, actions that you or I can take to combat racism in the workplace, and how community organizations, in a sense, can inspire change and social action. Well, this interest in understanding not only social inequality as it relates to social structure, but also what kinds of change can occur is nothing new in sociological circles. In fact, the notion of social movements as a source of social change has been studied since sociology became an academic discipline. Let's take a closer look at this process of social movement and social change. As I said before, the contradictions of social inequality that are built into our society are things that result in personal and group discontent. Now, one result of this group, individual, or community wide discontent is the social movement. What is a social movement? Well, it represents a large number of people who organize either to promote or to resist social change. So it's a physical social construct. It is a large group of people, large number of people who organize either to promote or to resist social change. Members of social movements hold very strong ideas about what is wrong with the world and how to make things right. Examples for this would be, of course, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, 1970s. It would include the women's movement of the 1970s, 1980s. It would include the animal rights movement, and of course, currently our environmental movements. At the heart of a social movement lies a sense of injustice, and that's important. And in identifying what that injustice is or articulating that, the sociologist then can identify or label what that social movement is. Some find a particular condition of a society intolerable, and their goal is to promote social change. Theirs is called a proactive social movement. Others, in contrast, feel threatened because of some condition in society, or if that condition is changing and they react to it or they resist the change. This is more of a reactive kind of social movement. Generally, when sociologists look at social movements as aspects or strategies that react to, in some way, shape, or form, social change, they will organize them into one of these two major categories. Now, to further their goals, people will develop social movement organizations, and these are the measurable, observable, physical expressions of the need, the proactive or reactive need for change or stability. Those who want to promote social change establish these organizations. To recruit followers or people who want to be part of a social movement and its organization, generally these groups will publicize their grievances. Leaders of social movements will use attention getting devices, marches, protests. Of course, media and media events are also very, very powerful. In fact, these are what we see or associate commonly with social movements and social movement organizations today. But ultimately, they are reacting to some sort of cultural crisis. A cultural crisis exists, they react to it, and in a sense are swept as a wave along in the reaction to these kinds of cultural situations, a cultural crisis in this case. Beyond the two major categories, proactive and reactive, we have a kind of typology that we can associate with social movements. And what I've done here is I've kind of boiled this typology into, or boiled it down in a sense, into the more common expressions or types. So, since social change is their goal, we classify generally a social movement and a social movement organization according to their target outcomes, and the amount of change that they are seeking. So, is the kind of change that is being sought, and then how much change is being sought in that particular subject or area. The first one I have listed here, alternative social movements. These generally will seek to alter some sort of specific behavior. A historic example would be the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a powerful social movement of the early 1900s. Its goal was to get people to stop drinking alcohol. Its members were convinced that if they were to shut down the saloons and the suppliers of alcohol, such problems as poverty, domestic violence, all of these, in a sense, would go away. A second type would be a redemptive social movement. Redemptive social movements also target individuals, but their goal is total change. An example is a religious social movement that stresses conversion. If we look at fundamentalist expressions of different kinds of religious schools of thought, we find this kind of redemptive social movement process. For example, when people convert to a particular religion, the entire person is, in a sense, supposed to change or has the potential for change, a new beginning, a new birth, in a sense. Self centered acts are to be replaced in usually these redemptive social movement environments by loving behaviors or behaviors that are turned outward as opposed to inward, thinking of others, and then, of course, evangelizing, spreading the good news. A third kind of social movement type would be a Reformation social movement. The target of this is for reform on a society wide level. Uh, Generally, the things like the animal rights movements, for example, have sought to reform the ways in which society views or treats animals. This would include reform to whole industries having to do with the production of food. If you think about organics, if you think about, in this case, grazing as an alternative to cage kinds of farming in this area, these all represent a kind of reformation. The idea of reforming the way we think about how to get to this outcome of um, larger food resources, society wide food resources. You have transformative social movements. In contrast, they seek to transform the social order itself. It's its members want to replace the current social order with their vision of what a good society is. So this would be situations where you have revolutions. If you think about at the turn of the century, and then, of course, in the early decades of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, the rise of a Soviet state, these are things that represent a transformation of society. The social order needs to change. How do we exact that change? It's through this transformative process. So we're not reforming as much as transforming. If you look at a social injustice or social situation and you say to yourself, well, I want to wipe the slate clean and start over again, that's transformative. But if you are focused on, in a sense, changing people's perspectives, that's much more of a reformative social movement. Next, we have a transnational social movement. This is a kind of social movement, and of course, the social organizations that are born of this kind of perspective are focused more on that process of globalization and what has become of the world as a result of global social change. So, as with many aspects of life in our new global economy, numerous issues that concern people transcend national boundaries, and transnational social movements will pick up on that. They are more human issues or species issues than national and ethnic issues. Examples would be labor movements, environmental movements, and movements that will incorporate or draw into their practices multiple nations, trying to bring everybody on board in order to exact change. Then we have, in this last category, metaformative kinds of social movements. So the goal of a metaformative social movement is to change the social order itself, not just a specific country, but the entire civilization, and again, on a global scale. So these last two focus more on global social change. For a metaformative social movement, their objective is to change concepts and practices of race, ethnicity, class, gender, family, religion, government, and of course, social stratification as it relates to our society and our nations. The idea of creating a common kind of global civilization is something that a metaformative social movement seeks to do. Much of what we see in Shirley Better's primer and what we have discussed as part of this lecture series focuses on a metaformative process of social change, something that is common to all human beings. Concerns regarding social inequality and injustice that can be applied across a wide variety of national, ethnic, and social and cultural environments. Today, nearly all of these social movement types, whether they are proactive rather, or reactive, will in some way, shape, or form be connected to mass media. Our technologies have inspired mass media to be a part of this process. So the leaders of social movements try to manipulate mass media to influence what? Well, public opinion. And I think probably the best example of this, and this is something that really began in the United States in the 1980s with the rise of CNN and other 24-hour, 7 days a week news networks, was in this case allowing individuals, allowing people to be exposed to news whenever they wanted it. Over time, however, this kind of constant exposure has turned into a little bit of an agenda based process. If I was to ask you to compare and contrast the perspectives of editors and reporters of Fox News to those of CNN and other outlets, you would right away focus on their philosophy. Their philosophy usually that is associated with a political perspective. This will, in a sense, or has the ability to potentially skew their coverage of a particular event or policy. Leaders of social movements recognize the impact that media has. If we move beyond cable news networks and start to focus in on what's in your pocket, maybe your cell phone, we realize, and again, social movement organizers have realized this as well, that you can be reached at any time. So the idea here is that if I flood the market with images and with ideas that align themselves with how I am acting or reacting to a particular injustice, I can, in a sense, influence public opinion. And as you influence public opinion, you will be, in a sense, given the resource that's necessary for social change. And we're seeing this happen on a global scale. Many people call this or label this to be a type of propaganda. In fact, many sociologists recognize mass media, if it has some sort of agenda or if it is trying to exact or stimulate some sort of need for social change through the lens of public opinion, they label it a type of propaganda. Now, this term comes with its own baggage. Very often we will associate propaganda with very negative historical trends. The rise of a totalitarian state government and propaganda and its use of propaganda is a very good example for this. But I'd like you to consider this term in a much more neutral fashion as you're looking at how social change is transformed into a social strategy. The idea here is that we have a group of people with individuals who recognize, in a sense, the need for change, and they use whatever is available to them. Mass media is probably the easiest, the most accessible form of resource for shifting or influencing public opinion. They use this in a form that can be assigned to this term. So, propaganda, in the sense of organized attempts to influence public opinion, becomes part of everyday life. If we can flood the news outlets, if we can flood the technologies that we carry with us with some sort of constant message, we're able to influence public opinion and ultimately achieve our goals as part of a social movement. Feel free to pause this video lecture for just a moment and look at this image having to do with the interactions, some of which I've talked about in this lecture, but a lot of which we've covered in our readings and in previous lectures associated with the course. These interactions ultimately get at what we are trying to achieve as part of a social movement and a social movement organization, which is social change. We have individual values, we have group values, and we have society values. And we have the constant interaction of these three major areas within social structure. As one changes, it will impact the others. They are not mutually exclusive. Social movements and social movement organizations tap into these interrelationships. So just take a moment and reflect on that. Sociologists today recognize or identify 5 stages in the growth and maturation of social movements. And I'd like to kind of go through these with you and get these into your notes. What you will see with this kind of list is that it is progressive in nature. Think of it historically, how a social movement organization develops and forms, how it exacts change, and when that change maybe has occurred, a change again that fits into that proactive or reactive major category, when that change has occurred or we have reached some sort of target or goal, what happens to that organization? Do they persist or do they close their doors and move on to a new need for change? Well, starting with number 1, what do we have? We have an initial unrest and some sort of social agitation. If you think about this like stages, this first stage People are upset about some condition in society. They want to change it. Leaders will emerge who verbalize very, very well people's feelings and crystallize these issues with regard to what needs to be done. Most social movements will fail at this first stage if they're unable to gain enough support or influence public opinion. Well, if they survive that first stage and they move on to this second stage of resource mobilization, they start to grow those roots that are important for their survival. Resource mobilization is a crucial factor. It enables social movements to make it past the first stage and, in a sense, gather the necessary resources to be able to persist. Resources may include access to churches or other social organizational regions or geographic locations. It may be the organization of a protest. It may be able to identify a particular kind of media outlet, get access to that outlet, and then broadcast from that outlet. A key resource for most social movements is communication and communication technologies. So, cell phones, the internet, blogs, all of these become very, very important in exacting change. As those resources are then mobilized, we move on to a third stage, which is the organizational stage. In terms of organization, we start to see a division of labor as it relates to some sort of achievable outcome. Leadership begins to make policies within the social movement organization. They rank and begin to organize individuals, groups, and subgroups within their developing organization. They share daily tasks and they identify the kinds of activities and actions that are necessary to keep the movement going. Fourth, there is an institutionalization that occurs. At this stage, the movement has developed its own unique bureaucracy. The type of formal hierarchy develops that allows governance to occur. Control in this case lies in the hands of career officials who may carry out more important duties than other individuals within that organization. And in a sense, the leadership is recognized as making the greatest of sacrifices in order to achieve the targeted goals that the organization has. It's a kind of collective excitement that stirs at this point, and a formalization of the organization itself. As the organization acts on all of this need, as it begins to organize itself and create its own system of internal social control, what occurs? Well, change potentially occurs as a result of these first four stages or first four practices. As that change occurs, or as the organization then adapts to that changing landscape, and of course the outcomes of their work, they will either persist or decline. And that's really the last stage, which is organizational decline or resurgence. During this phase, managing the day to day affairs of the organization dominates the leadership. There is a change ultimately in public sentiment that may allow the organization to persist or to be better funded. And then we start to see, in a sense, the change occurring. And so they're able to reflect back on what they have achieved in that social arena. Generally, and then looking at it through a historical lens, these stages of social movements, these particular growth areas within a social movement organization and its history, all in a sense are things that we can identify with and see in the history of the United States and what currently is occurring with regard to major subjects, things like health care, things having to do with our labor market, equal pay, the minimum wage. all of these particular topics are things that have had and continue to have social movements developing around them and organizing around them.